Welcome to the review of the RE21. This is our real estate purchase and sale agreement for residential use. As always, every year, a lot of the changes that are made to purchase sale agreements are made to all of the purchase sale agreements. So whether it's residential, commercial, vacant land, they're carried forward. And what you see on your screen right now is an example of that. The responsible broker line, as we know, is always identified in a purchase sale agreement. It was just in a different place. It was a little bit lower in the form. The forms committee wanted to make sure that the responsible broker was something that was addressed right at the top of the contract. Very important. So they wanted to give it the importance that it deserves by moving it up there. And it makes sense. When you're talking about listing brokerage and selling brokerage, the conversation can naturally flow right into the responsible broker. So not necessarily a text change, but a relocation. And that relocation will be reflected in all of the purchase sale agreements going forward. That will be true for a lot of these changes, although we may not specifically state that or identify that. You're going to want to review, as you always should, all of the changes to the forms that are published so that you can familiarize yourself with how they have changed and how that affects your practice. So moving on to our next change, we get down here into a change that actually, if I scroll back up, this language used to live up here, and it's all actually tied to this particular line. This offer is contingent upon the sale, refinance, or closing of another property. Over the years, this line used to be combined with a line that we can see that was down below here. It's now been moved. Used to be here under the financial terms up above, but it is now living down here. So we're talking about where the money might be coming from, and this is third party. So this is the buyer is bringing some money coming from any third party. This is not necessarily tied any longer to the sale of their other home, although it certainly could be. So again, this is just kind of over years has been massaged to make more sense. And so if you look back at the RE21 2025 version, you'll see that this language appeared a little orphaned where it was before. The committee reviewed it, addressed it, and said, this really belongs down here in E. When we're talking about funds due from buyer at closing, we know how the math is supposed to work. When we're talking about new loan proceeds, if it's a cash buyer, obviously we don't have these circumstances. But when we get to C, we're going to put a number here. We're going to put a number up here on this line, and then we're going to, you're going to have D. There's going to be some additional financial terms. You're going to have E, and so that it's all supposed to add up, so we know exactly where all the money is coming from. So when a seller gets one of these, the seller can understand what the buyer's doing, and so. This would be where it's being addressed that the buyer's bringing other funds at closing. Frequently a seller wants to know, okay, is it coming from anywhere else? And, whether that be, gift from Aunt Matilda or, something along those lines, this is where you're going to disclose it's coming from a third party non-lender source. And this, again, is new language, but it's really not. It's just revising something that used to live up here earlier in the finance contingency section. So moving on to the next change in our purchase sale agreements, and this will be reflected in other purchase sale agreements as well. There's two changes we're going to address here in the title insurance section. One of them deals with revised disclosures, and the committee spent a lot of time on this section this year, both parts of this. But the first part we're talking about dealing with revised disclosures is the first two paragraphs that are highlighted. The second thing we're going to talk about is this one down here. So put that on your mind for a moment. Let's just look at these two paragraphs. And it begins with this language here on line 148. And this deals with the circumstance where title commitments are being revised, something that is becoming more and more of a common practice throughout the state, where a preliminary insurance policy is provided very early on in the transaction, and then for whatever reason, a revised disclosure has to be made by the title company. And so what would have existed in previous versions of this form would be that we know that once there is a disclosure about the title of the property, the buyer had a certain amount of time. It was 2 days if left blank, and that's this language that was addressed up here. That always lived there. And so if there was a revision to title, it only made sense the buyer still had those 2 days because they never had a chance to look at it. And of course, when they have those 2 days to look at it, they also have those 2 days with which to object. So But with these title revisions, revised disclosures becoming more and more common, the committee felt it was important to address that specifically. So what happened is this language was written, revised, and ultimately adopted into the contract. So we're dealing with a revision. It basically says the exact same thing that was always said up here in the previous paragraph, which is buyer is going to have a certain amount of time to review. In fact, we literally tie it together when we say shall have the same duration as indicated in the initial disclosure stated above. So they're going to have that same amount of time to review any revised disclosure and object to it the same they would have in the original disclosures. So that was the real reason that the committee started getting into this section, was to bolster that and to provide some very clear language when something happens to change it as it goes forward. So then, we had to address what happens if buyer does timely object or does not. Obviously, if they do not object, then there is nothing that happens. But because we changed some of this language up here, we had to change what happens when buyer objects. And so there was this language not necessarily changing in substance as to what buyer's rights are. That's all the same if you've been practicing for years. Not a lot of practice changes there. We just changed the wording in the way that objection happens. And so, again, making it so that buyer could object several times in one transaction if there are several updates to the report. And so that's what these paragraphs are about. I strongly recommend that you go through all of them, understand how it works, come up with some examples of what ifs and run them through scenarios so that you have a good working understanding of how that operates now. Hopefully it makes the transaction smoother, and it just clearly identifies that buyer always has the right to look at that any updated or revised disclosures from title company. The second part, or the second update to this section begins here on line 161. This is completely different than what we've just been talking about with the revisions above it. This particular paragraph addresses a circumstance where a seller was unaware of a condition or a defect affecting seller's property. The committee spent a lot of time talking about these peculiar circumstances that seller would get into where seller learns something on the title report that is a problem for seller. If seller is selling their home, they have an idea of how much they want for that home, how much they're going to net, how much they're going to put in their pocket. Sometimes something may pop up that reduces the amount of money that a seller is going to put in their pocket. To provide just a simple example, if a seller is going to sell their home and go buy another home, they want to have enough money to be able to go buy that other home, whether that means financing the other home or simply paying cash for that other home. The seller has an idea of what they're going to get out of the sale of their home. That idea can be significantly impacted if there was an unknown circumstance to the seller that suddenly reduces the amount the seller's putting in their pocket. And so the Forms Committee thought it was appropriate to address that, to not put seller in a circumstance where they're now forced to sell a home and they don't have enough money to go buy a second home. And there were a lot of specific circumstances that folks had seen, and they all shared their stories with the Forms Committee, and the Forms Committee adopted this language to address that circumstance. And so you can see what this looks like here. Just let's look at it practically speaking for a moment, and then we'll talk about the idea of what this does and is it a giant escape clause for seller, which it's not, but we'll talk about that second. So let's look at just the mechanics of it, how it would work. First of all, you have to have a circumstance that is applicable. So this is a circumstance that seller was unaware. It's a circumstance, a condition, or a defect. And that language is something that's already been used, in here when we're talking about title defects and things of that nature. So this was just pulled from other parts of the contract to where we're talking about a circumstance, condition, or defect unaware to the seller. So that's where you got to start. So let's say one of those comes up. All right, now what happens? The seller also, there's a second part of this where the seller has to learn of it in a title disclosure. So again, that's the second condition of before we get to trigger this sort of escape clause for the seller, if you will. So you have to have both of those conditions met. Then we get to the point to where the seller then shall have the option to terminate this agreement by providing that written notice of termination 2 business days to the buyer. So that's the mechanics. Seller learns of this unknown circumstance, condition, or defect, and they learned of it from a title disclosure. now we got 2 days. Seller can then just say, buyer, look, I'm sorry, I wasn't aware that was out there, and this isn't going to work for me because I need to be able to go buy another home. And this circumstance, whatever it is going to be, if it's for example, if there's maybe a judgment or a lien or something that the seller was unknown, or that was unknown to seller, we all know those get paid out of closing, out of the net proceeds going to the seller, and so it's going to reduce that. And so this is a circumstance that was, going to affect that, and so seller now has the chance to say, sorry, buyer, wasn't aware of it. It's not going to work for me. I'm terminating. And then we have language in here that states that upon said termination, any earnest money shall be returned to the buyer unless it has become non-refundable. If you watch all the other videos, I talk a little bit about that language, unless it has become non-refundable. We know that buyers can enter into transactions where earnest money becomes non-refundable for whatever reason. It's a very serious situation for a buyer, and hopefully before buyer went into making that agreement with a seller about non-refundable earnest money, they thought about the parade of horribles and the what ifs that could go wrong, and considered that and said, yeah, that's okay. I'm still willing to risk my earnest money and make it, become non-refundable. There's very good, very legitimate reasons for a buyer to do that. But the buyer always needs to know non-refundable means that. It means non-refundable. So when you're doing that, it's a risk. And of course, we know from practice that there's a whole other section of this contract that deals with defaults and how defaults are handled, and a breach by seller, earnest money conversations are gonna transpire. But anyway, so again, there's some language in there. Earnest money shall be returned to the buyer unless it has become non-refundable. But again, let's go back to what I was sort of hinting at earlier. Is this a giant escape clause for the seller just to walk away because they get a better offer? The answer is absolutely not. The Forms Committee was very, very concerned about that, and they did a bunch of their what ifs and circumstances, scenarios, and sort of gamed this out to see what could they do to narrow this down. And right away, they wanted to be very, very clear that this is not just going to be something for a seller to walk away just because something showed up. The buyer actually has a much larger walk away. The buyer doesn't know what's happening with the property. The buyer gets to see everything, and the buyer can object based upon the terms that are disclosed. The seller has to have something that's unaware of a circumstance. And so this is, again, it's a condition. This is not just, yeah, I knew I had that lien out there, but I was kind of hoping title company was going to miss it. That would not fly. The seller was aware of it. The seller knew the lien was out there. The seller, the seller knew there was a judgment. The seller was in a litigation in a lawsuit that they lost, and they knew that judgment was out there and was affecting their property. Those are all things a seller is going to be aware of. Those will not qualify. This has to be something the seller can, legitimately in good faith say they were unaware of this circumstance. Okay. And then again, there's a second trigger, like I talked about before. It's just not unaware of it, but you learned of it through the title company. So that is going to narrow it even more. And so the Forms Committee really spent a lot of time really massaging this language, coming up with different adverbs to use, different things to describe the circumstances, conditions, and defects. Spent a lot of time on this to try to narrow it as much as they could, but yet still provide seller with the appropriate out in appropriate circumstances. So that's a change to the purchase sale agreement that, again, you want to spend some time on, go through it and understand how it would work and understand what the limitations are and when it can be used for sellers, because a seller needs to know their rights and a buyer needs to know their rights, and it's this language is going to be very important for that. Bringing us to our next change here in the inspection paragraph. This is our section 12. As we know, our current forms state the seller shall make the property available for inspection. This language right here, that exists as it sits today. It's been there for a very, very long time. It's an obligation of the seller to open up the property for the buyer so the buyer can do the inspection. It only makes sense if a buyer's going to make the contract contingent on an inspection. They're going to want to get into the home and look at it and crawl all over it. And so over the years, some complaints have happened where a seller is not necessarily making the property as available as it is needed. We know that during inspections, the home inspector, depending on what level of inspection they're doing, they're going to want to see things. Almost always an inspector is going to want to see the electrical panel. Well, what happens when the seller's garage is full of boxes, and they've got them all stacked in front of the control panel, and that inspector can't get to it. That inspector is going to note that in his inspection. It's going to say, look, I can't tell you anything about the control panel or the knowledge I would have learned by looking at the control panel, and so I didn't inspect it. That is something the buyer then looks at and says, oh, well, wait a minute, that's really important to me. It's an important part of any inspection. I need to have that. So rather than having to then go through it again and have the buyer's inspector come back out and talk to seller and say, hey, look, you were supposed to make it available. And also to just eliminate, what is the argument over what does available mean? The committee wanted to add some teeth to make available, so they added this language, including but not limited to the electrical panel, the attic, the HVAC, and crawl space. Those are all things that the committee found are typical in an inspection that an inspector is going to want to see. They also found that there are also the ones that are frequently blocked: control panels in garages, attics, HVACs, crawl spaces. Especially if the access to the crawl space is in a closet somewhere, quite frequently closet floors get covered with things that make access difficult. And so now there can be no argument as to what it is the seller is obligated to do when a buyer chooses to conduct inspections on the property. This access has to be allowed. Okay, moving on to just a small change here we call this the cost paid by grid. There was language added making it clear that when we're talking about a tax service fee, that's a tax service fee required by the lender. That brings us to another change down here in section 20. This is not a major change, and actually what's highlighted is not what was added. It is literally of the final sales price is all that was added. This is just to provide clarity. It was pretty obvious what everybody was talking to, an amount equal to blank percent. That's language that's used throughout the industry as industry standard. Realtors would be advising all of their clients as to what it means when you talk about, about percentage compensation. This is just providing some additional clarity, making sure that everybody understands it's a percent of the final sales price. This brings us down to the last change in our purchase sale agreement. Down here in the assignment section, which exists in all the purchase and sale agreements, the Forms Committee just wanted to clarify what happens if there is a box where we have may or may not, and it's not ticked. As we always state, there is what the best practice for every practitioner out there is to address every single option in these forms with your client. Go through them line by line, tick all the boxes, fill in all the blanks, be intentional about what you're doing. Ultimately, though, the forms are designed to address circumstance that if there is one of these boxes that is overlooked, the Forms Committee always works hard to try to address those to catch something. And so maybe this box wasn't ticked by either the seller or the buyer, or sometimes I've heard circumstances where the buyer doesn't care, so the buyer just leaves a blank and says, well, I'll leave it up to the seller. Then the seller doesn't, address it. And so it just goes by, and when we've got these two boxes that are not checked, and then we, have an argument about is this assignable or is this not assignable? So the Forms Committee cured it by putting a default in there, which is may be assignable. And that's the end of the changes to the RE21 specifically. As we stated at the beginning of this video, a lot of these changes were carried forward into multiple purchase and sale agreements. So you'll want to review each and every one line by line so you know what those changes are. But there are some additional videos that will help you with other purchase sale agreements.